Alright guys, hopefully this will be the last set of notes with me not being there. I'm planning to hopefully come back on Thursday. I'm starting to feel a little bit better, and then hopefully I'll see you guys then. So we're going to talk about aerobic respiration. Now respiration is the topic of this entire unit, and it's kind of the opposite of photosynthesis, which we'll see here in a little bit. But the reason why we have this word aerobic in front of it is because aerobic means with oxygen. So think back to the photosynthesis equation. At the end of photosynthesis, the plant gives off oxygen. Well, for respiration, we need oxygen, and aerobic just means with oxygen. Okay, so aerobic respiration is the process of breaking down glucose in the presence of oxygen to release energy that is transferred into ATP. So the whole point of respiration, well, let's back up to photosynthesis. The whole point of photosynthesis was for plants to make their own glucose that could be transferred into energy. Now for respiration, the whole point of respiration is that obviously we get our food, we learn from ATP, we get our food from other living things, whether it be plants or animals. We break down that glucose in the presence of oxygen, and that's going to give us energy. And remember, it's kind of like Chuck E. Cheese, glucose is a form of energy. However, it's not the right currency. We have to break it down even further into ATP so we can use chemical equation. So ATP can be used for reactions with inside our body to give us energy. Okay, so to kind of help you remember this, it can get a little complicated like photosynthesis did with the reactions. But the best way to remember this is to kind of remember it and group it into steps. So step 1 is going to be glycolysis. So let's look at that word. Glyco, we're talking about glucose here, and lysis means to break down. So every living thing is going to use this process of glycolysis. And glycolysis means the definition, the splitting of glucose. So remember in the equation, we need one glucose molecule, which is 6 carbon. It's going to split into 2 pyruvic acids, and each of those pyruvic acids have 3 carbons in them. Okay, so the first step of cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration, is glycolysis. And we're going to break down this glucose and we're going to split it into 2 pyruvic acids. Okay, so glyco, again, we're talking about glucose here. Lysis means to break down. So we're breaking down this glucose. Again, you can see the molecular formula here. We're splitting it into 2 pyruvic acids. Okay, 2 ATP are gained at this process. Now, I do want to talk about this since you guys are honors. We do talk a little bit more in detail here. Notice that it says net. Okay, and what we mean, I'm going to show you in the next picture, is what happens is actually this process is kind of like take and give. In order to do glycolysis, you actually have to use 2 ATP to get it started. So 2 ATP are used to break it into 2 pyruvic acids. But then at the end, we get 4. So if you take the 4 that we got at the end and subtract it from the 2 that we needed to start with, we end up with 2 ATP. So that's why it says it's a net gain. Because technically at the end we get 4, but overall if we include the 2 that we had to use, it's going to be 2 ATP. And this process is going to occur in the cytoplasm of the cells. Okay, so aerobic respiration, the very first step, glycolysis, happens in the cytoplasm. Okay, so here's the picture I was telling you guys about. This is a really good picture that kind of breaks down this first process. So here's our glucose molecule. Remember, we need 2 ATP, so we put 2 ATP in here. Think back, we just did this in the notes on Tuesday. In order for ATP to be used, remember that last phosphate bond gets broken and releases the energy, and then it goes back to ADP. When we do that, it breaks it into 2 pyruvic acids, and at the end, this process gives us 4 ATP and 2 NADH. And it says 2 electron transport chain, which we'll talk about here in a second. Okay? And then our final outcome is 2 pyruvic acids. Now, since we have 4, remember we did have to use 2, so that's where the 2 net comes from of ATP. And we also gain 2 NADH, which was kind of similar to NADPH that we talked about in photosynthesis. It's responsible for carrying electrons. Okay, so step 1. glucose is split into 2 pyruvic acids, 2 ATP are gained, remember that's the net, and it occurs in the cytoplasm. Now let's talk about this. Where does cellular respiration occur? Which organelle? So think back to yesterday's notes. Hopefully some of you guys know this. But most of this is going to take place in the mitochondria. So that's where the next step occurs. Okay, step 2 occurs in the mitochondria. This is called the Krebs cycle, sometimes known as the citric acid cycle, but we'll mostly call it the Krebs. Those pyruvic acids that we just broke down are going to be broken down even further into carbon dioxide. So remember, in photosynthesis, plants needed carbon dioxide, but what do? Okay, maybe some of us already know this, but we exhale CO2. So we break down those pyruvic acids even further to CO2, and that's exhaled. During this process, we also gain 2 ATP. So right now, we're at a total of 4 ATP. Okay, during this process, there are lots of hydrogens are picked up by NAD and FAD. Again, both of these are electron carriers to make NADH and FADH2. These carry the energy source to make ATP. Okay, so kind of a form of energy that's going to allow us to make more ATP, which is the goal of respiration. We want energy. Okay, step 3, the electron transport chain. This also occurs in the mitochondria. Those hydrogen electrons that were carried by the NAD and FAD are used to supply the energy for 32 ATP. Okay, so let's think of the steps. We had 32 from ETC, 2 from the Krebs cycle, and 2 from glycolysis. So overall, we made 36 ATP. So every one glucose molecule gives us 36 ATP. All right, and then when we're completed, the oxygen that we take in and hydrogen atoms bond to make water. Okay, so let's say we don't have oxygen. Without oxygen, the Krebs cycle and the ETC do not occur. So you can still do glycolysis, which you'll get a total of 2 ATP, but compared to 36 ATP, obviously we're always going to want to go through this process. Later, I believe next week, we'll talk about the process where there is no oxygen and what happens. But for now, I want you to focus on we need oxygen to make the most ATP that we can. Okay, so totals. Glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen to produce CO2, H2O, and 36 ATP. Hopefully you noticed something about this equation. This is almost the exact same equation as photosynthesis. So remember, when we were practicing with those cards, I said this is really important to know. Basically, all we did is we flipped the sides and took out sunlight. So these guys were over here, and these guys were over here. It's opposite. So for respiration, we need 1 molecule of glucose, 6 oxygen. We don't need sunlight. That would be problematic if in order to breathe we needed sunlight. We make 6 CO2, 6 H2O, and then 36 ATP. That was that pink little card that we practiced with. Okay, so now for this equation, it's the opposite. These are the reactants, and these are the products.